I was looking round to see if I could spot Wolfgang Schroeder.
It's me.
Well, right, there you are at
Yeah.
the end, so you're too far. Right, the floor is yours. The timer is on, and we'll see how the questions pan out after your paper. Okay?
Thank you very much.
I think actually it may be ideal if we could take your paper and Aimé's together for questions, but we'll see how the papers work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Eccellenza Reverendissima, dear Mr. President, honorable members of the Academy, dear colleagues. First, I have to apologize. I had some minor health problems with headaches in this morning. This weather doesn't like me. Obviously, it's too humid. So, this is fancy stuff, robots and rights, and I try to review in the remaining 19 minutes the recent most prominent positions in legal philosophy and ethics on this. Well, robots, as it seems, are here to stay, but with which status and under which normative conditions? Controversies about the moral and legal status of robots in general and of humanoid robots in particular are among the top debates in recent practical philosophy and legal theory. What some find appealing, the others deem appalling: robot rights and legal personhood or e-personality for AI systems. So, my paper proceeds in three main steps. It begins with definitions of central terms and an exposition of central aspects under which robots as AI embedding machines or AI agents even can become a topic of moral and juridical discourse. Then follows a brief review of some of the most prominent theses from recent literature on the moral and juridical status of robots, and in conclusion, I try to give a balanced intermediate result and a modest new proposal on what we should do or what we could go on thinking about this issue. So we will start with the definitions. First of all, as a good philosopher that I try to be, I try to define the terms. When I'm talking about rights, that can be done on two different levels, first on the ethical levels, but also on the legal theory level. So I would suggest that robots, generally speaking, are AI embedding machines, sometimes even AI agents. And the ethical discourse on that, if we consider moral norms and rights that could possibly be bestowed to AI agents, I think that can probably best be understood as theory building on descriptive or normative abbreviatures of commonly acceptable social conduct. That would be my general definition of what the ethical discourse is about. And as regards the juridical concept of rights, the legal rights talk, I just follow the standard Huffieldian account, according to which rights issues can be broken down into a set of four categories. Rights can be either privileges or claims or powers or immunities. So that is the terminology I'm trying to work with. Now let's see what there is already. You might all know the three famous laws of robotics. They are quite interesting. You can have a look at them. The problem is, who is speaking? Is this an ethicist? Is this done by legislation? Or is that just an author of fiction? And so this might be an inspiration for our issue, but it also shows there is thinking about what laws on robots and rights of robots there could be, but as long as we just don't know who is speaking and what type of rights can possibly be attributed to robots, or if this is rather not desirable. So we have to go on talking about this. And I just wanted to start first by looking back to what we are actually talking about when we are talking about AI systems. There was sort of a controversy here what AI actually is, and this controversy is a very general problem. Look at these two proposals. What do you think is a definition for artificial intelligence? Is it proposal 1, the intelligence is the ability to derive a maximum of relevant conclusions from a minimum of information? Or is it proposal 2, intelligence is the ability to derive a minimum of relevant conclusions from a maximum of information? We probably will agree that it could be proposal number 2 that is referring to artificial intelligence. So from this first glance at the problematique, one should never know that you could mix up human persons and AI agents, especially not if you are just focusing on the matter of intelligence. These are so different types of intelligence that actually that would encourage us to give a very short answers. Robots cannot have rights, and they should not have rights, since that would be mistaken. Also, that is something that that shows how different wisdom or knowledge or information is processed in the big data world. You see, wisdom that would be part of the human intelligence is about highlighting some of the information, some of the knowledge that you have. I think Wolf Singer was talking about that in his paper, whereas just relating pieces of information or patterns is that what AI does. So also from this respect, it is not very likely that you can confuse artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And this is what makes us human persons. All these dimensions, these very different dimensions of human or biological intelligence, there is no way right now that any coder or any software specialist could code all these different things into one concept of artificial personality, as far as I know. But on the other hand, there are so many things going on in the artificial world. I don't know if you can see that exactly. This is what happens in 1 internet minute. And it's a comparison between last year and this year. I don't know if you can see very precisely how many things are going on. So this is part of our normal all-day life. And so this might be an incident that hints us at the importance of coming to terms with this artificial world. So defining the field, in my view, would require first to see that in classical moral theory and legal theory, it's the ontological stance that gives us an orientation on how to deal with the questions whether or not robots should have rights or not. But in most recent times, there is a relational turn in animal, robot, and machine ethics. And I'm referring to a Vienna philosopher, Mark Kuckelberg, who was already mentioned this morning. Kuckelberg is very skeptical about the normal ontological or property-focused approach to the classificatory thinking in animal and machine ethics. So normally entities are considered in isolation from other entities, thereby reducing ethics to a kind of mechanical thinking. For Kuckelberg, this raises 3 major problems. How can we know which property is sufficient, or at least decisive, for ascribing moral status? And second, how could we indubitably establish that an entity indeed has a particular property S? And finally, how could we define really sharp boundaries between different kinds of entities? So Kuckelberg's skepticism about a property-based ethical classification leads him to plead for a rather ecological anthropology as proposed by Tim Ingold. In Ingold's ecology of materials, all the entities that are around are considered as nodes in a field of relationships, which can only be understood in relational and ecological and developmental or growth terms. Following Ingold, Kuckelberg interprets the moral standing as an expression of active, developing relationships between entities. Instead of asking what property P counts for moral standing S, the new thing is here, how should we relate to other beings as human beings who are already part of the same social world as these non-human beings who experience that world, and those other beings that are already engaged in that world and stand already in relation to that world. Thus, Kuckelberg considers relations as a basic condition for moral standing, not ontological properties in substantive terms. Yet relations are not be seen as properties, but rather as an a priori given in which we are already engaged, making possible the ascription of moral status to entities. So this is the relational turn I was referring to. I will now shortly review some of the most recent juridical tendencies towards advocating legal personality for robots. I will start with Günther Teubner, who is a German legal scholar. He is advocating legal personality for AI systems. He's in favor of granting them rights and even the right to property, depending on the degree of independence that these AI systems are bestowed with. On Teubner's account, the granting of legal personality to AI systems would fill the accountability gap, thereby maintaining the integrity of the legal system as a whole and advancing the practical interests of humans. So what is this lack of responsibility and the lack of accountability that this is supposed to be a solution for? That means that advocating legal personality for robots could solve a legal problem. Well, there is two levels that are to be considered in legal terms or in terms of legal theory. First, that is the level of civil law, and second, the level of the criminal law. In criminal law, only natural persons, at the sense of the law, real living persons, can be held responsible for their actions. And at civil law level, on the other hand, legal persons such as companies can be included. So the legal construction or fiction of legal personality for companies is often taken as a paradigm for legal personality for robots. It has nothing to do with citizenships. It has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with personality in a strict human sense. It's just a construction. It's just a fiction. A company is not a human person, and it doesn't have citizenships. And this kind of fiction of legal personality that is also possible for companies would be the paradigm then for robots. Yet the robots of the future will learn independently and will make decisions based on their past experiences. And programmers can and must provide a faultless framework for this. However, if the robots are wrong in their experience-based decisions, manufacturers cannot be held so easily accountable. In general, one could say as long as the manufacturers have acted with all possible and reasonable care and have made no mistakes, they cannot be guilty, according to our criminal law understanding. At the civil law level, there is still the possibility of liability, which does not depend on fault. The manufacturer could then be prosecuted if the damage is due to a fault on the robot due to the manufacturer. Otherwise, it would be difficult to hold anybody liable for what has happened. So, if the robots violate their duties and cause damage, they would be responsible in a moral sense. For example, financially also. But in principle, robots act independently with their experience-based decisions. They just cannot be punished like humans. You just cannot turn the electricity off and then think that is a punishment for the robot. For example, even imprisonment means nothing to robots, which is quite clear. And robots do not have their own assets. Maybe one will fund up with whose funds the penalties for the machines are paid, or ultimately it is the manufacturers who are responsible for the mistakes of their robots. So you need to watch the devices, detect and fix errors. In the worst case, the manufacturers, have to call back the robots. A legal scholar from the US, Sean Bayan, has claimed that legal personality for robots on the same terms as companies is already possible in US law. There are many lawyers who say this is not the case, and it's very unclear if the US courts would follow Sean Bayan on that. And there's one more recent large book on the issue by Jacob Turner, and he has written a book on robot rules, which focuses on 4 arguments by which you could possibly tell whether or not it would be morally or even legally possible to attribute legal personality or rights to robots. The first is the argument from the ability to suffer. That would require at least some degree of consciousness, since otherwise you could not suffer. But the problem is, how could a robot really suffer? And if he could, that is probably only a simulation of pain. And the second argument is the argument from compassion. Humans develop a certain kind of affinity or some, maybe even friendship, maybe not only to teddies, but also to smart little very cute computers or robots. And so this might be a rather pragmatic way to argue for rights for robots. The third possibility would be the argument from value to humanity. So that has to do with the idea that robots and AI systems as such, and robots as machines that embed AI, artificial intelligence, are the product or the paramount product of the German mind and of the human, not of the German mind, sorry, that was nonsense, of the human mind. Sorry for that, but I explained that that was a mistake.
Game up.
So it was a value also to humanity that something like AI could be constructed, and that might inspire a kind of feeling of awe and respect for such a high-level product of human intelligence. And this last one maybe is the most interesting one, and maybe one of the arguments that deserves a closer analysis. This is the argument from Post Humanism. So that has to do with the legal and the moral status of cyborgs or electronic brains. So the question is, if there are human beings that also have a lot of high tech in their body, do they lose anything of their humanity, or will the high tech take over the whole person? And what does that mean in moral terms and in legal terms? So, looking at the time, I will be very brief with the last things. There is one other very important and very let's say, original book by David Gunkel, and he is promoting this book all over the world, Robot Rights. He also follows the relational turn, but he also relies very much on Levinas's theory of ethics. And Levinas has also said, well, not the ontology is the first thing in moral theory, but the human face. Looking at one another says we are not going to kill each other. So this relation between human faces and human person is the ground for moral theory, not the property that we are human beings endowed with rationality, not the idea of the animal rationale, but the human face. So the problem here is that humanoid robots have simulated human faces. So, and it is by no means to see how one could apply Levinas's theory of ethics, which is constructed for human beings and real human faces, could apply to fake faces of robots. And so, in my opinion, I think Joanna Bryson's critique on that is the most convincing, or one of the most convincing stands on that issue. She is very much in favor of an ethics of human responsibility for robots designs. She says we don't have to trust AI, and we should not grant them, or robots, we should not grant rights or legal personality to robots. That sort of mixes up just everything. It's a mess that may hide that we are the ones, society and the manufacturers are the ones that are responsible for how AI is built, how AI is trained, and how it is tested and monitored. And so all things for which humans can be held to account, and that should be taken very seriously. So my last thing, what we actually still lack, even if we can agree that there are good reasons for not giving rights to robots, what do we do with simulations of human beings? And so I would argue very much in favor of thinking ahead towards a new part of ethics that helps us to understand how we can relate to machines that have artificial intelligence but are still machines. And my concern is that we need such a new ethics or new part of ethics, since we have to make sure that the moral continuum will not be damaged. I would not appreciate if there is any part or any room in society where you can live and where you can relate to machines that look like human beings, and you do things, or take sex robots. Very intimate things can be done with machines, and that might be some place in the world where you can treat human-like people like machines. How can you switch then back to behaving in a normal, ethical, human way? And that's why I really am very much in favor of having a new, maybe also more relational type of ethics that takes into account that we right now do not really know what moral categories or even legal categories should be applied to simulations of human beings. So that is what I could offer. Thank you very much for your kind attention.